By the end of this video, you're going to have a fully customizable, event-driven shape editor using the line renderer component in Unity.
Alright, I have a new empty Unity project here. First things first, make sure this is an orthographic camera. Up first, it's quite simple. We just need an empty game object we can use to hold the lines that we're going to create to draw between the dots. So let's call this line parent. We also need a canvas that's going to hold the dots. This is going to be a screen space camera overlay, which means it's going to be a world space camera. Why do we need a world space camera? Well, we need a world space camera because the line renderer is a world space component. If we want to draw a world space component line renderer between two UI objects, it's much easier and makes the code far simpler if we just make the canvas a world object instead of a screen object, so we don't have to convert anything. Make sure you drag the main camera under here in the renderer camera, and you're good to go. So finally, we need our canvas to draw the lines onto. So come in and create UI canvas. We're going to put it in between parent of the lines and the dots, and we're going to call it the pen tool canvas. Make sure this is also a screen space overlay with the main camera. Now under this pen tool canvas, we need something that's going to detect our clicks. So if we come under here, hold Alt and Shift, and right click here, it's going to stretch out the image to fill the entire canvas, which is going to fill the entire screen in the game view here. And let's call this pen canvas. So this is the physical canvas that is going to detect your clicks, detect the paintbrush, and is going to allow you to draw on top of it. Make sure that raycast target is enabled, because otherwise it's not going to detect any of your clicks. Let's give it a nice color. I have a color palette already saved in here, which you can find in the description down below. And that's it for the pen canvas. The last thing then is the loop toggle, which is in the top right corner. So let's come over UI image, hold Alt and Shift again to move it into the top left. And let's change its position 50 across, something like 50 down, just to have it be even. Now let's get this source image, pen tool, sprites. Once again, all of these images will be found in the description. And for now, because it's not going to do anything, let's just leave it as the default. Okay, that's everything you need. Now let's go ahead and make the scripts. So we need a pen tool controller. I'm just going to call it pen tool. First things first is we need to reference the parent object for both the dots and the lines. If we go back into Unity, the dot parent is this dot canvas here, and the line parent is the line parent game object that we created. Now we've done this, we actually need to create the prefabs which are going to be used for the dots and the lines. We'll come in here and we'll make a folder called prefabs, open it up. Now for the dots, let's come in here and create UI image. Let's use the dot image here. And I think that's a bit too big for me, so I'm going to scale it down just slightly. That looks pretty good. We don't want these to be too big. Let's check the game view. Yeah, that's fine. So once we have this dot correct, we can name it and simply grab it in the hierarchy and take it down into the prefabs folder. Now, you can see we've created a dot prefab. We can drag as many of these into the scene as you want, and you can see here this is how we're going to be creating the dots. As for the line, it's going to be a very similar process. Create an empty game object, call it line prefab. Go to add a component, find the line render component now, just so we can test out the points. These won't matter because they will be changing them in code, but just so we can test it out, so we can see it. We've got this line here. That's a bit too thick for me, so let's make it about there. Let's see how it looks. It looks good. And our material, lucky for us, Unity has one built in. It's called the default line material. Go and select that. Make sure you have it selected. Once you've done that, drag the line prefab into the prefabs folder. Okay, perfect. Now we've got that, we can open back up the pen tool script and we can reference these in code. As you can see in the final version of this pen tool script, you have a current line that is being highlighted and that one turns pink, and that's the one you can edit. So let's come in here and create that component. We need a private current line. But what type should this be? Well, we're going to need to create our own custom one that we can put on the line prefabs so we can play about with them. So let's come over into our pen tool folder, prefabs, line prefab. If we come over here, we need to add a component. Let's call this line controller. This is going to allow us to dynamically change the points on the line at runtime. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, the first thing we're going to need to do is if we want to draw a dot at the mouse position, when we click, we're going to need to check if we've clicked. So this code here detects a left click. Now if we don't already have a current line, we're going to need to create a new one. If current line equals null, checks to see if we already have a line that we're working with. If we don't, then current line is going to be a new line. Now you can see this is having an error because the instantiate function returns the game object and we're trying to save that to a line controller variable. So what we need to do is we need to grab the line controller component that we put onto that prefab. Okay, perfect. Now we know we have a current line. We need to do pretty much the same thing again, but we need to create the dot. Where do we want to put the dot prefab? Well, we want to put the dot prefab at the mouse position. So we need to create a function which is going to get our mouse position. This function simply calculates the world position of the mouse, which is where we want to instantiate the dot. So let's use this function for the position of the new dot. So now we've made this dot, we want to add this dot to the list of points that our current line is going to go through. So we need to add some sort of add dot function to the line. Let's go back to Unity and open up this line controller script. And we're going to need to make a few variables here. So we need a reference to the line renderer, and we also need a list of points. Now when the game starts, we need to grab the line renderer component. And we also need to initialize our list of points. One final thing we need to make sure we do is we set the number of points in our line renderer to the number of points that we actually have. Our position count is going to be 0 because we don't have any points. So now we can create our add point function. All we need to do is tell the line renderer that it has a new point by increasing the point count, and then adding that point to our list of points that we have here. Finally, we actually need to give our list of points to the line renderer so that it can draw them. So I'm using late update here, so it allows all the dots to move around before this gets called, so it's always going to be drawn in the correct position. Points.count greater than or equal to 2, make sure that there are actually 2 or more points to draw a line between, because if you just have 1 point, then there's no line, it's just a point. And then we loop through all the different points we have and assign them to the line renderer. Now if we go back into our pen tool script, we can find our current line and call this new add point function and give it the position of our dot that we just created. Now if we go back into Unity, make sure we have the prefabs assigned in here so they can actually be created. And just like that, we can now draw shapes when we click the mouse. Very nice. Now we've made it to this point, I want to go a little bit more advanced with the code we're going to be writing, because I don't know what you're going to be using this component for in your game or whatever you're making. So the best way to get around that so it can be used for anything is to use events. If you don't know what events are basically ways where we can assign things to do when something happens, and then when that something happens, trigger off all the things that need to be done. For example, you can see at the moment we are checking if we've clicked the mouse button in the update, which is going to run every single frame. Well, instead, let's create an event which checks for when the mouse is clicked and does something when that happens. If we come over to the pen canvas and we add a pen canvas component here to it, as I said earlier, this is going to be the component that detects your mouse clicks. We're going to want to use an interface, and it is the iPointerClick handler. If you've never seen this before, then don't worry, it's not as scary as it looks. All it is whenever this component that has the script on, which is the green background, is clicked, then we're going to do something. As you can see here, if you right click, it will automatically create the function for you. This specific type of event is called an action because we're not going to return anything. So now, whenever we click on this object, we want to call this event. Perfect, so .invoke runs anything that is assigned to this function here. And this question mark makes sure that if there's nothing assigned to this, then we're not going to run it anyway, because if we did, then that would cause an error. Now, if we come back into our pen tool, we need to have a reference to this pen canvas, and then we also need to assign the function that gets run at that event. So this is our reference variable to the pen canvas. So at the start of the game, we want to subscribe and add dot function to this event we just created. And remember, this event is called whenever we click on the green background. So let's make an add dot function now. And we can now remove the update function. Make sure you assign the pen canvas in the inspector. Perfect, so now we have the exact same system set up, but it's using events now instead, so it's much more generic and can be used in any situation that you want. All you'd have to do is subscribe to that onClick event in whatever sort of situation that you're going to be using this code in. Up next, let's work on moving the dots around once we've already placed them down. Come into the pen tool, prefabs, dot prefab. This time we're going to make a controller for the dots. So the dot controller is going to be moved around when we drag it. So we need the iDrag handler. Just like before, we're going to make a new event. This time it's going to be an onDrag event. And for whenever we drag this dot, well then we're simply going to call this onDrag event. Back in our pen tool, let's create a moveDot function. And here we run into a bit of a problem. We don't know which dot we want to move. This function is sort of completely generic and has no information about the dot because it's not on the dot. We want our dots to be basically as stupid as possible. All they know is that they're being dragged. This way we can make them do whatever we want. But to be able to move the specific dot we want, we need a reference to that dot. So when we create the dot up here, first of all we actually need to get the dot that we've created. So instead of getting the game object here, let's now get the dot controller. Now just before we add this dot to the line, now whenever this dot is being dragged, it's going to call this function here, which is going to move it. The only issue is that this isn't actually passing any information to this script. So we need to come back in here and make this action take a parameter of the dot controller and give it this, which is this dot that we are currently on. So to recap, when we start dragging, we're going to call this event and give it the dot that's currently being dragged. That is then going to run this function because we assigned it up here to the event with the dot, and we're going to move it. And just like that, we can move dots around. So we can add dots. Now we should probably figure out how to remove them. Back in our dot controller, let's make it so it can now detect if it's being clicked. So this is just the same code we had before. This time, instead of detecting a drag, it's going to detect a right mouse click. And up here, when we create the dot, so we're going to remove the dot when we right click on it. When we remove the dot, however, we do run into a few problems. The line renderer is trying to draw a line through that point that the dot is at. So when we remove the dot, it's not going to have anything to draw, and that would cause an error. So what we need to do instead is we need to delete the line that was there and create two more lines. One of those lines is going to connect up every dot that was before the dot we deleted, and the other line is going to connect every dot after the dot we just deleted. You can of course delete the entire line if you would like, but I'm going to show you how to do this now because deleting the whole line is a lot easier to figure out by yourself. To be able to do this, we need each dot to know which line it is a part of. So if we come back into the dot controller, let's add a public reference to the line. And then we're also going to make a function which sets the line so we can actually give it to the dot. Then once again, when we create the dot, we now need to also set the line, and this is going to be to the current line that we're trying to draw. Now we have one more thing we need to do before we can create the remove dot function, and that is we need to be able to split the line up into the two parts, both before and after the dot we just deleted. To do this, firstly, let's convert our line controller from holding transforms to the actual dots themselves. We'll need to make a few changes, namely to the update function down here, and we no longer want the transform, we want the actual dot itself, so we can remove that there. So here is our split points at index function. This is going to take all the points that we are currently trying to draw a line between and split them into a group of 2 different points, both before the dot we removed and afterward. Now you can see we have this index here. This is going to be the index of the dot that we're trying to delete, and to be able to give the index of the dot we want to delete to this function, the dot needs to know what index it came from. So because we have our dot here when we're adding the point, let's rename this to dot now. So when we're adding a new dot, then obviously the position of this new dot is our length of our current amount of dots. To be able to make this work, we need to come back into here and give the dot a variable to hold the index. While we're here, just to keep things easier, we can also set the line to this line while we are here, because that's always going to need to be done when we add a point, and then we can come back into the pen tool and remove it. We're finally ready to split the points at the index. First things first, we need to create the list before and after. Then we need to loop through every single point, add anything before to the before dots and anything after to the after dots. Finally, then we need to return, using the out parameter of the function, the new dots. Now we've split up the line, we're finally ready to come back and create this remove dot function. So when we remove the dot, firstly we need to get the line that the dot is a part of, which means we also actually need to pass the dot controller into this function so we know which dot we're removing. Now we have this line, we need to split it. Now we have these points, we don't need the old line anymore, and we need to destroy it so it isn't in the way. While we're destroying things, we also need to get rid of the actual dot itself, because once again we're removing it. The final step is we need to create the new line between all the dots before and after. So let's create the new line. This is exactly the same way we created the line before. And for every single point in our list of dots before, let's add it to this before line. We can simply now just copy this and do this again for after. And that's it. If we go back into Unity now, save everything, we can still create dots as normal. We can drag them around and we can right click on one to delete it, which removes it, creates 2 extra lines, which we can now also still drag around and do whatever we like. We can remove that as well, which just leaves 1. And we can keep going as perfectly working shape, custom shape design with line renderer component is now fully ready to go.
One final touch, let's add the ability to move on and work on a different shape without having to delete anything from the previous one. Okay, so now we're going to end the current line whenever we right click on the green. So to be able to end the line, we first need to check that we actually have one. And if we do, we're going to just set it to null. Remember that if we find when we go to add a dot that we don't have one, we're going to create an entirely new line down here. So all we have to do is set this to null and we'll start working on a new line. Let's test this out really quick. Let's draw some lines here. Right click on the green, that means we're no longer on this line, we're no longer working on this, and we can start drawing a completely different one somewhere else. The final step is going to be making it so you can edit lines that you've already finished, you've gone on to draw another one, and then you decide, no, you know what, I want to add another point to this line that I've already got here. So to do this, let's come down to our onPointerClick event, and let's add a left click event. that when we create the dot, let's assign something to that. All we need to do is make sure we end the line that we're currently on, and then set the current line equal to the line from the dot.
That is everything I want to show you for today. The toggle in the top left, let's do that very quickly. The toggle in the top left, all you need to do is simply, if you come into the line renderer component here, let's draw a line really quick. You can see in the line prefab here, there's an option in the line renderer called loop. That is what creates this effect of closing up the shape. To do that, we can say whenever we click that button in the top left, we can simply toggle the loop. If the line renderer was already looping, we're going to set it to not loop, and if it wasn't looping, we're going to set it so it is. We're going to basically reverse whatever the looping state is of the line renderer. You can do as much as you want to this now. I've added a few more things here. As you can see, I've changed the color of the line with an active color and a normal color. So here you are, a fully working custom line renderer shape drawer component tutorial completed. There we go. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've learned something useful. I hope this can help you out in your project. If it has, please be sure to let me know. If you haven't liked the video, please be sure to also tell me that. I love to take any criticism you have to help improve the channel in the future. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, happy coding.